Facts. I've been told facts don't change minds. I enter into this conversation understanding that individuals who fundamentally disagree with me are only going to be incensed, and people who agree with me are only going to be elated. Nevertheless, I want to introduce the alternative hypothesis thoughts here and build off of these notions. I've identified the alternative hypothesis definition of race to be predicated upon scientific racism, biological determinism, and cherry-picked items, so we'll be reviewing their definition through these lenses. If you have any questions or would like clarification, ask me in the comment section below. What we're going to do here then is describe the claims being made by the alternative hypothesis, consider whether they have indeed proven that races meaningfully exist and have accurately represented both sides of the discussion, and then develop a counter-argument which successfully demonstrates alt-hype's race realism is untenable, while ultimately defining race as a social category in terms which are both coherent and convincing. The alternative hypothesis makes three principal assertions to lend a semblance of credibility to his claims that I would like to address in this video. 1. Race is biologically real and socially real. These are not mutually exclusive terms. 2. Human populations being distributed clinally does not preempt the existence of races. 3. Evolutionary processes have acted upon isolated populations of human beings, resulting in the existence of differences which are significant enough to explain life outcomes and differences in intelligence and behavior we see between races. This is fundamentally the same logic used by Herrnstein and Murray in their infamous book, The Bell Curve, and so, quite serendipitously, debunking the alternative hypothesis will go a long way towards dismantling and rebuking this controversial narrative in its entirety. Let's return to the alternative hypothesis' first claim, that race is biologically real and socially real, and that these are not mutually exclusive terms. I agree naturally with the notion that these are not necessarily mutually exclusive terms. However, with this quite uncontroversial claim, alt-hype has included an assertion that is not warranted by the evidence. That is, that races are biologically real. Let's review the evidence and counter some of his common assertions. I'll address 3 points again here. 1. That so-called race denialists demand unnecessarily stringent definitions of race. 2. That clustering provides an adequate and accurate justification for assuming races exist. 3. That assuming such races exist has predictive power. As examples of so-called denialists that require overly stringent definitions of race, alt-hype brings up 2 individuals and their claims about race, Lewontin and Templeton. Essentially, his argument revolves around their use of fixation index distances and the setting of arbitrary bounds by which we can delineate races. Since Lewontin's claims are less precise and less relevant to this discussion, I'll be discussing Templeton's paper with you. Templeton, in the 1999 paper cited on alt-hype's website, makes the claim that to delineate races, a species must exhibit an FST value of 0.25 or greater. And this seems to be based upon a misunderstanding of another paper. If you understand fixation index values in the least, it becomes clear that this is a rather peculiar standard to hold, as species can have lower fixation index scores and still have races. I'm not here to defend Templeton's mistakes, but I do find it highly suspicious that alt-hype chose this specific paper. I find this suspicious because Templeton has written similar papers since, such as his 2013 Races in Humans, which repeats the same mistake clearly in its text. Why not target that paper, which expands his arguments and more clearly articulates Templeton's positions? What's the difference between the 99 and the 2013 papers, you might ask? Well, Templeton dives much more deeply into the question of what constitutes a race, leaning heavily upon the notion that races are divergent populations which can be measured according to at least 3 evolutionary criteria. A MOVA scores greater than or equal to 0.25, which again is just an indication, not a qualifier. B. That sharp geographic boundaries exist between the races, and that procreation between the 2 races is rare if it ever occurs. And C, Distinct evolutionary lineages are apparent, and these are tested by using phylogenetic constructions. Calling this definition stringent is misleading to an extreme degree. We have analyzed the hypothesis that races exist in humans in much the same ways we've analyzed other species, such as fin whales, chimpanzees, etc., and we've found no indication that races exist in humans. To claim that such definitions are stringent, and to instead insist that race is a qualitative measure of simple variation, is to radically redefine races or subspecies according to social fabrications and categorizations, as these are how we make sense of these variations in our societies, and this flies in the face of the scientific method and evolutionary science. As I mentioned earlier, we assess races or subspecies according to the evolutionary process because the existence of races or subspecies denotes that divergence is occurring within a given species, and that it is likely that, eventually, these subspecies will differentiate into two different species. In other words, race, like any other concept in science, is supposed to have predictive power concerning the phenomenon it is attempting to describe. Conflating social fabrications of race with scientific classification confounds the entire conversation and undoes the work of generations of evolutionary scientists. Humans are not predicted to become different species, and there are many reasons why, which I will get to in just a moment. Ironically, the alternative hypothesis, in arguing against static measurements of variation as a methodology by which to discern races, i.e., using fixation index scores as qualifiers, has constructed their own argument for a methodology for discerning races which is logically equivalent, i.e., we can group populations into clusters, therefore race exists. In fact, it is using a measure of variation as a means by which to discern races, the exact same thing they're arguing against. As a final note on this subtopic, the scientists who performed the studies that sorted human populations into clusters originally disagree that their studies indicate races exist in humans. Assuming races exist, of course, has predictive power. How could a system of categorization based upon similar genetic, geographical, and phenotypic characteristics not? The question here is not whether there is predictive power, but whether the methodology is the most appropriate and accurate for making these predictions. Spoiler, it's not. Biomedical research has consistently and is increasingly coming to the conclusion that individual genetic analysis is far more appropriate, accurate, and effective for treatment than is race, which is often misleading. Race has historically been used as a poor proxy in biomedical research, but as new technologies have been developed and as the negative consequences of assuming race have become more clear in biomedical studies and treatments, the field has moved away from the utilization of race as a proxy. The same trend is seen in other biological sciences and anthropology, fields in which the use of race as a proxy has historically had most success. It is increasingly apparent that race is a poor proxy and is being replaced. We're now going to consider the second major argument presented by the alternative hypothesis, that the clinal distribution of populations of humans does not preclude the existence of races. By the evolutionary definition, this does, actually. This entails that genetic material is spreading from clinal area to clinal area, dispersing genetics into geographically distant areas, and providing a venue by which genetic admixture can and is occurring. This is why, although they didn't mate with Neanderthals directly, some African populations have small amounts of Neanderthal DNA. Additionally, this argument entirely ignores the fact that we don't live in only a clinally distributed world. We have sophisticated and advanced transportation technologies, and have for centuries, which have allowed direct contact and admixture between geographically distant populations, and this trend is increasing. Again, humans aren't predicted to differentiate, and in fact the opposite is true, as we'll get to in just a moment. The final argument the alternative hypothesis has constructed goes as such. Evolutionary processes have acted upon isolated populations of human beings, resulting in the existence of differences which are significant enough to explain life outcomes and differences in intelligence and behavior we see between races. This is the most obscene and scientifically inaccurate portion of the alternative hypothesis arguments. and the most pernicious, which will become increasingly clear as we descend into the race and IQ sections of this debunking process. I'm not going to challenge this here because it leads directly into the next section on race and IQ, but I would just like to comment that at this point the alternative hypothesis has not provided an accurate, compelling, or honest depiction of both sides of the debate concerning the existence of races, has not provided a likewise accurate, compelling, or honest definition of race, and has exhibited such a truncated and reductive perspective on the entire matter that it is clear to me that this is nothing more than racist and extremist propaganda. What I would like to comment on is the glaring lack of historical context to the alternative hypothesis discussion of the existence of race. Specifically, I'd like to dredge up the fact that there used to be races of humans up until 12,000 years ago and the beginning of the Holocene and the advent of agriculture and larger society. Up until about this date, it would seem that many different races of humans existed across Africa for up to 300,000 years, displaying remarkable diversity and features. Every race had a mixture of archaic and modern features, some with heads shaped fantastically different from what we have today, and these groups appear to have been separated for significant periods of time. Then, our climate settled into a temperate period we're still in today called the Holocene. Agriculture and society bloomed, and by 12,000 years ago, all populations with archaic features died off, and only modern human features persevered, having been more uniquely capable of adapting to and exploiting agriculture and the advent of society. This resulted in an extreme bottleneck, which homogenized our species into the modern Homo sapiens sapiens, but it would not be the last. A new theory states that men almost pushed our species to extinction between 7,000 and 5,000 years ago, leaving only one man alive for every 17 women as patriarchal tribes across our ranges clashed violently. Once again, this resulted in a bottleneck and the further homogenization of our species. Since then, evolution has sped up in our species as culture and agriculture have expedited human population growth and the geographical expansion of our habitats. The truly ironic thing about the alternative hypothesis pleas for people to buy into their race realism is that they denote the desperate state of racists. Alt-hype's designs for ethnostates are further ironic because the truth is that if humans were going to differentiate, now would be the time, but we're not. The admixture of populations and the homogenization of our modern technological environments and world increasingly nullify the possibility for the development of races in humans, and this is why alt-hype clamors for ethnostates and the abandonment of populations he views as inferior. They are the last-ditch effort of racists terrified that they are being eclipsed. What makes this conversation even more absurd is what Sam Harris has commented on in his podcast, to his credit, which is that human beings are standing on the precipice of genetic engineering. Our species is about to make fantastical leaps into places that we can't even imagine. The alternative hypothesis is stuck in the past. Stay tuned for Chapter 2, Race and IQ. Take care.